with school just around the corner, I think it's appropriate to begin by saying when you're doing a paper, homework assignment, in my experience anyway, there's two ways that it comes to an end. One is that you get to the end of it and you look at it and you think, okay, I've put in everything I know. Everything is here, everything's properly sourced and footnoted, and this is as good as I can make it. Or you get to the end and you look back at what you've done and you think, this is as good as it's going to get. So as I was working on the sermon this week, I kind of ended up in that last one. So just a little warning. I was listening to the gospel reading or the epistle reading and thinking, wow, I should have talked on that instead. So the Old Testament reading today, which was actually much longer, those were just excerpts from the long reading. Those of you who heard all of the different verses and went, could have been a lot worse. But it was about the dedication of Solomon's temple. This was the first temple in Jerusalem. And Solomon, the wise king, was the one that built it. And it was a grand affair. He called forth all of the elders of Israel and the people, and he made this great dedication. And the temple itself was a beautiful thing. It was huge. It was gorgeous. It was amazing to look at. You want to think, now that was about 3,000 years ago. If you go back a little further than that, about 1,000 years or so, 2,000 maybe, we have the pyramids. Grand structures also. And you go back further than that. In Turkey, southeastern Turkey, there's a place, it's called Göbekli Tepe. You may have heard of it. It's down in, like I said, it's in southeastern Turkey. It's down along the borders with Syria. And it's an archaeological site. They've been digging there since the 1960s, but it's only in the last 10 to 20 years that scientists or archaeologists looked at the structures that they had been excavating. And first of all, they really suddenly realized how massive this site was. And they also were able to tell that it was a temple. It was a sacred place. It was a place meant for worship. And what's really fascinating about that is that Göbekli Tepe was last occupied about 10,000 years ago. And this temple structure was built about 12,000 years ago. So 9,000 years before the time of Solomon, these Stone Age people built this huge structure. These were people for whom, flint was the latest wonder tool, and levers and rollers were high tech. And yet they invested all of that time and that effort into building a temple. Why would they do that? What is it that drives people to connect with God by pouring their hearts and treasure into building sacred buildings? That's what I wanted to talk about a little bit today. In early Old Testament times, before Solomon and before David and before even Moses, there were no temples being built, but what the people would do when they had a religious experience at a particular location, they would build an altar. They would take the stones that they found in the area and they would build an altar here. And the purpose of the altar was to say, I had a religious experience here. Here in this very spot, I encountered God. And that was important enough that I want to mark this, because I may want to come back here and experience God again. And for you people, that haven't experienced God yet, maybe you come to this place and you will get to experience Him too. These altars were raised up to mark sacred spots where humanity and divinity intersected. And it was thought at the time that location was important. So it's possible that for Solomon at least, and for his people, the temple that later came was kind of an evolution of this idea of building altars, because you have this altar and over time, it falls down. But if you make a building, then you've got something that'll last. And if you make a big, solid building, you've got something special. You build a big, ornate temple as a way of honoring and respecting God. It's a way of saying, hey, God, look what we're doing for you. We're building this huge building. And we're making it special just for you. And sometimes, particularly in ancient times, perhaps, an ornate temple was a way of showing a little swing to the heathens around you. It was a way of saying, look, we love our God so much that we're willing to spend an enormous amount of money to worship God. We are willing to use only the best materials. So you should pay attention. Solomon, for instance, when he built the temple, he didn't just use expensive cedar lumber. Even back then, cedar was expensive. He took the cedar and he overlaid it with gold to make it extra special. So it was a way of saying, this is what we're investing this much in worship of our God, so maybe you should pay attention to Him and us. And kind of running parallel to that, a well-designed temple or church would also communicate a sense of the divinity of the God that was being worshipped. You have a nice, soaring, massive structure, and that reflects a soaring and massive, powerful God. And we still do that today. In a more limited sense. Look up. Do you ever wonder why churches tend to have these huge open spaces up here? That's intentional. It's meant to represent first the vastness and the power of God, and it also reinforces the smallness of the people that are inside. There's a deliberate choice made in the shape of the building to reflect our relationship with God. And one other aspect of temples and churches that came along later is protection. When you have people gathering to worship, they need to be protected from the elements, and sometimes they even have to be protected from other people. So there's a number of reasons for building a place of worship. It can mark a physical location where you had an experience with God. It's a way of showing respect to God. It's a way of showing off a little bit. And it serves as a shelter. Then there's one other reason. Haven't mentioned it yet, but it's something that Solomon mentions in his dedication to the temple. To the people of Israel 3,000 years ago, building the temple was a way of localizing God, as they called him Yawheh. What does that mean? It means that the people back then believed that the building, if they made it the right way, if they made it fancy enough, if they made it awesome enough, that would provide a place for Yahweh to be when he came to earth. Sort of like what they were doing was they were sort of like building a really nice in-law apartment in Jerusalem, so that whenever God came to visit, God would go there. Which was nice, but it was also kind of a way of trying to put God in a box. Because what you're doing then is you're taking God and you're saying, you know what, God, you come right here and you stay here, and you're not going to be out wandering around causing trouble. The idea, part of the idea at least, was to say, you know, we really love Yahweh. We love him a lot. But we love him even more if we can keep him kind of under control, where we can go to him when we need him, where we know he'll be, but we don't always have to worry about him being out among us. And that persists a little bit sometimes today. Because sometimes maybe it's nice to keep God in a box. Maybe it's nice to keep God in church where we know where to find God, and God's not out and about poking into our lives when we really don't want the interference. Maybe it's nice knowing that there's a particular place we can go to on a particular day, and we can get all of the God stuff out of the way. And that frees us up for the rest of the week, without having to think that we might be running across God every time we walk around a corner. Maybe it would be kind of a relief sometimes to think that God isn't necessarily looking over our shoulders all the time during the week, but instead is just content to have us come and check in every Sunday. Or every other Sunday maybe. Or maybe one Sunday a month. Whatever our schedule allows. And there might be some comfort in all that for some people. But Solomon showed how really smart he was, because he shot that idea down when he was dedicating the temple. He shot down the idea that God can be confined in one location when he said, even heaven cannot contain you, much less the house that I build. Or as I said in the title of this, nobody puts Yahweh in a corner. Solomon was saying you can't confine God to where you want God to be, because God's everywhere. God is in all aspects of our lives, or at least he should be. And what Solomon did say in the long version of that prayer, you can tell he was a politician, because he just went on and on forever. But Solomon continually called upon God to be listening. He said, hear and respond to your people. Not stay in the box here, but listen. And he even said to listen and respond to the foreigners, to the strangers when they call upon him. And he did all that because Solomon knew that serving God and being obedient to God was not a part-time, once-a-week thing. Solomon knew that serving God was a way of life. And he knew that God, for God's part, was not a disengaged, check in once a week, tell me how it's going kind of God. Because God loves us way too much for that. God loves us way too much to not push us when we need pushing. God loves us way too much to let us be content with words rather than actions. God loves us way too much to let us get away with calling ourselves Christians without acting like it. The ancient people of Israel might have been mistaken to believe that God could be found in any one place, and Solomon said that much. But for us today, the just as big a mistake is to believe that God is somehow relegated to just Sundays. That we can define our relationship with God by what we do one day out of the week. Because God lives among us. God is everywhere. When we believe in God, when we believe in Jesus Christ, God's within us. When we act those beliefs out, God is within us. So we actually kind of carry the church within us. God does live here. God does listen here. This is a place where we can come and speak to God. But when we leave, we take God with us. When we leave, God is there to guide us. And a true relationship with God, a healthy relationship, means that God is a part of us every day. He's a part of everything we do. Solomon knew that. He was smart. It's something that we should know too.